In 1925, a convicted murderer walked out of Texas State Prison after serving just 7 years of a 30-year sentence. His weapon? A 12-string guitar and a song pleading for mercy. 9 years later, lightning struck again when the same man talked his way out of Louisiana's notorious Angola Penitentiary with nothing but his voice and a desperate plea to the governor.
You're a fine songster. I've never heard so many good Negro songs. Thank you, sir, boss. I sure hope you send Governor O'Callaghan a record of that song I made up about him, because I believe he'll turn me loose.
His name was Huddie Ledbetter, but the world knew him as Leadbelly, the man whose music would go on to inspire Bob Dylan, influence the Beatles, and give Kurt Cobain one of his most haunting performances.
And carry to the captain.
But the legend of the man who sang his way to freedom is far more complex and controversial than anyone imagined. This is the real story. The man who would become Leadbelly entered the world in 1888 on the Jeter plantation near Mooringsport, Louisiana, where violence was as common as cotton. Huddie William Ledbetter was born into a world where disputes were settled with fists, knives, and guns, where a black man's life was worth little, and where the only escape from grinding poverty was through pure talent or pure luck. By 14, young Huddie had already made his choice. He quit school after the 8th grade and dove headfirst into the weekend Suki jumps and juke joints that dotted the Louisiana-Texas border. His weapon of choice was a 12-string guitar he called Stella, and even as a teenager, his voice could silence a room full of hardened workers and gamblers. His father had given him his first guitar, but it was the streets that taught him how to use it. In the red light districts of Shreveport, particularly along the notorious Fannin Street, Huddie absorbed every musical influence he could find: blues, work songs, ballads, spirituals. He learned that music wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. When I play, the women would come around to listen and their men would get angry, Leadbelly would later recall. And angry men in 1902, Louisiana meant trouble. The frontier mentality still ruled this part of the South, where bootleg whiskey flowed freely and disputes were settled with blood. Huddie quickly discovered he had a talent for both making music and making enemies. By 16, he'd left home for good, wandering the Southwest with his guitar, picking cotton when he needed money, performing when he could. He was legendary among field workers for picking 1,000 pounds of cotton a day, but his real reputation was being built in the joints and brothels where his music could earn him more in one night than a week of backbreaking labor. The violence found him early. Family members recalled seeing him come home at 14, all cut up from fights. A white scar stretched from ear to ear across his throat, a permanent reminder of one particularly brutal encounter. But Huddie wore his scars like badges of honor. In his world, a man who couldn't fight didn't last long, and a man who couldn't play didn't eat. In 1915, his violent lifestyle finally caught up with him when he was convicted of assault in Harrison County, Texas, and sentenced to a chain gang. But prison couldn't hold Huddie Ledbetter. Within months, he had escaped and was living under the alias Walter Boyd in DeKalb County, Texas. For the next few years, he managed to stay one step ahead of the law, but his luck was running out. The end came on a cold night in December 1917. Huddie got into a fight with a man named Will Stafford, and when the dust settled, Stafford was dead, and Huddie was facing a murder charge. At his trial in 1918, the judge showed no mercy: 30 years in Texas State Prison at Huntsville, with a minimum of 7 years before he could even hope for parole. For most men, that would have been the end of the story. But Huddie Ledbetter wasn't most men. He had his voice, his guitar, and a plan that seemed impossible, but just might work. If music had gotten him into trouble, maybe music could get him out. As the prison gates slammed shut behind him, Huddie began plotting what would become one of the most audacious gambles in American music history. He was going to sing his way to freedom. Texas State Prison at Huntsville was hell on earth, but for Huddie Ledbetter, it became a stage. The man who had terrorized juke joints across the South now found himself entertaining some of the hardest men in America. And they loved every note. Prison officials quickly discovered they had something special on their hands. Huddie's 12-string guitar could cut through the noise of 1,000 inmates, and his voice carried stories that spoke to every man behind bars.
Once more, Leadbelly. Good night.
Guards who had seen everything were amazed by his ability to command an audience, and word of the musical prisoner began to spread beyond the prison walls. Huddie adapted to prison life with the cunning of a born survivor. He worked hard, stayed out of fights when he could, and slowly built a reputation as both a model prisoner and an extraordinary entertainer. The guards began bringing him to perform for visitors, and it wasn't long before the most important visitor of all took notice. Governor Pat Morris Neff was a complicated man. He had campaigned for office on a platform of law and order, explicitly promising voters that he would not issue pardons. It was a popular stance in 1920s Texas, where crime was rampant and citizens wanted tough justice. But Neff was also a deeply religious man, and when he heard about the musical prisoner at Huntsville, his curiosity was piqued. The first time Neff visited the prison to hear Huddie perform, something extraordinary happened. The hardened politician found himself moved by the raw power and emotion in the prisoner's voice. Huddie sang work songs, spirituals, and blues that told the story of black life in the South with an honesty that Neff had never encountered. But more importantly, Huddie began crafting a song specifically for the governor. Please Pardon Me wasn't just a song, it was a masterclass in persuasion set to music. Huddie had studied his target well. He knew that Neff was a religious man, so he wove biblical themes and appeals to Christian mercy throughout the lyrics. He knew that Neff prided himself on his humanity, so he made his plea personal and heartfelt. And he knew that Neff, despite his tough stance on pardons, was ultimately a politician who could be swayed by public opinion. The song went, "Governor Neff, let me go back home. Please, honorable governor, be good and kind. If you don't get a pardon, will you cut my time?" But the real power wasn't in the words. It was in Huddie's delivery. When he sang about his mother waiting for him at home, about his promises to live a better life, about his faith in God and his trust in the governor's mercy, even the toughest guards found themselves fighting back tears. Neff began visiting the prison regularly, often bringing guests on Sunday picnics to hear Huddie perform. Each time, Huddie would perform his plea for mercy, refining it, perfecting it, making it more personal and more powerful. He was essentially conducting a year-long audition for his freedom, and he knew he had only one chance to get it right.
You're a fine songster. I've never heard so many good Negro songs. Thank you, sir, boss. I sure hope you send Governor O'Callaghan a record of that song I made up about him, because I believe he'll turn me loose.
The breakthrough came in 1924, when Neff was in his final year as governor. With his term ending and nothing left to lose politically, the governor who had sworn off pardons began to reconsider. Huddie had served 7 years, the minimum required, and his behavior had been exemplary. More importantly, Neff had become genuinely fond of the prisoner who had entertained him so many times. On one of Neff's final visits to the prison, Huddie made his ultimate plea. He poured everything he had into his performance of Please Pardon Me, singing not just with his voice, but with his entire soul. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, including the governor's. In 1925, just before leaving office, Governor Pat Morris Neff did something that shocked the entire state of Texas. The man who had promised never to issue pardons granted a full pardon to Huddie Ledbetter, convicted murderer. The official reason was good behavior, but everyone who had witnessed Huddie's performances knew the truth. He had literally sung his way to freedom. The news spread like wildfire through the prison system and beyond. Inmates across the South began to believe that maybe, just maybe, music really could open any door, even the door to a jail cell. But for Huddie, the miracle was just beginning. He had proven that his voice was more powerful than iron bars, and he would need to prove it again sooner than anyone imagined. Freedom lasted exactly 5 years. By 1930, Huddie Ledbetter was back behind bars, this time in Louisiana's Angola Penitentiary, facing an even longer sentence for attempted murder. The man who had sung his way out of one prison now found himself in the most notorious prison in the South, and this time, the odds seemed impossible. Angola was different from Huntsville. Built on an 18,000-acre former slave plantation, it was designed to break men's spirits as well as their bodies. The mortality rate was staggering, the guards were notoriously brutal, and hope was a luxury few inmates could afford. When Huddie arrived, he discovered that his previous conviction made him ineligible for early release. He was looking at serving his full sentence in one of America's most hellish prisons. But Huddie had learned something important during his first imprisonment. Music was power, and power could be leveraged. He quickly established himself as Angola's premier entertainer, organizing concerts for both inmates and guards. His reputation grew until even the warden acknowledged that Huddie's performances were one of the few things that kept the massive prison population calm. What Huddie didn't know was that his music was about to attract attention from the outside world. In 1933, a Harvard-educated folklorist named John Lomax was traveling through southern prisons, recording traditional African-American music for the Library of Congress. When Lomax arrived at Angola, the first name everyone mentioned was Leadbelly. The meeting between Lomax and Leadbelly was electric. Lomax had spent years collecting folk songs, but he had never encountered anyone with Leadbelly's combination of musical skill and authentic experience. Here was a man who hadn't just heard these songs, he had lived them. His repertoire included work songs, prison ballads, spirituals, and blues that hadn't been corrupted by commercial recording. This was the pure, unfiltered voice of American folk music. Lomax recorded several songs during that first visit, including Goodnight Irene, which would later become one of the most famous songs in American music. But more importantly, he listened as Leadbelly told him about his previous escape from prison through song. Lomax was fascinated by the story and began formulating a plan that would make Leadbelly's legend even larger. When Lomax returned to Angola in 1934, with better recording equipment, he brought more than just microphones. He brought hope. Leadbelly had composed another song, this time addressed to Louisiana Governor Oscar K. Allen. Following the same formula that had worked in Texas, he crafted a personal plea for mercy, appealing to the governor's humanity and Christian faith. Please pardon me. For Governor Allen was even more sophisticated than his song for Governor Neff. Leadbelly had learned from experience, and he understood exactly what buttons to push. The song was part autobiography, part confession, and part promise. He sang about his mother, his newfound faith, and his desire to use his musical gifts to serve God rather than the devil. Lomax recorded the song and personally delivered it to Governor Allen's office. The folklorist presented it not just as entertainment, but as evidence of Leadbelly's unique cultural value. Here was a man who carried within him hundreds of songs that represented an entire musical tradition. To keep him locked up would be to silence a living piece of American history. On August 1, 1934, Leadbelly was released from Angola after serving just 4 years of his sentence. The official reason was the double good time rule used to combat prison overcrowding, but everyone knew the real story. Leadbelly had done it again. he had sung his way to freedom. The press seized on the story with sensational headlines. The New York Herald Tribune proclaimed, "Sweet singer of the swamplands, here to do a few tunes between homicides." The legend was born. Leadbelly was the man who could charm governors with his guitar and convince hardened politicians to open prison doors with nothing but a song. But what the newspapers didn't understand was that Leadbelly's escapes weren't just about his musical talent. They were about his understanding of human nature, his ability to read his audience, and his genius for crafting exactly the right message for exactly the right person at exactly the right time. He hadn't just sung his way out of prison. He had manipulated the system with surgical precision. After his release from Angola, Leadbelly found himself thrust into a spotlight he had never imagined. John Lomax had become his manager, promoter, and self-appointed guardian, and he had big plans for the ex-convict who could sing like an angel and had lived like a devil. Lomax brought Leadbelly to New York City on New Year's Eve 1934, promising him fame and fortune. What Leadbelly got instead was something far more complex. He became the face of authentic American folk music, but at a price that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The New York intellectual elite embraced Leadbelly as a living artifact, a genuine representative of Black Southern culture untainted by commercialization. He performed for professors, folk music enthusiasts, and cultural critics who saw him as a window into a world they could never access themselves. But many of these performances felt more like exhibitions than concerts. Lomax often introduced him as a dangerous criminal from the Louisiana swamps, playing up his violent past for shock value. Despite the exploitation, Leadbelly's influence on American music began immediately. His repertoire was vast, over 500 songs that spanned every genre of American folk music. Songs like Midnight Special, Rock Island Line, Cotton Fields, and Boll Weevil would become standards, recorded by countless artists over the decades. The folk revival of the 1940s and 1960s was built on Leadbelly's foundation. Woody Guthrie studied his style and borrowed his techniques, learning how to combine social commentary with traditional melodies. Pete Seeger saw Leadbelly as a model of musical activism, understanding that folk music could be a weapon for social change. When Bob Dylan arrived in Greenwich Village in the early 1960s, Leadbelly's influence was everywhere. Dylan absorbed Leadbelly's approach to storytelling, his ability to create complex narratives within simple song structures. The young Dylan covered Leadbelly songs and cited him as a key influence in learning how to fuse music with social messages. Even the Beatles felt Leadbelly's impact. Paul McCartney was particularly drawn to Rock Island Line, performing it live and incorporating its rhythmic drive into the band's acoustic explorations. The song's simple structure and infectious energy became a template for countless rock songs that followed. But perhaps Leadbelly's most profound influence came decades after his death, when Kurt Cobain discovered his haunting version of Where Did You Sleep Last Night? Cobain's performance of the song on MTV Unplugged in 1993 was raw, emotional, and devastating, a direct echo of Leadbelly's soul-wrenching intensity. That performance introduced Leadbelly's music to an entirely new generation and proved that his emotional honesty transcended time and genre. Leadbelly's influence extended far beyond individual artists. His approach to music as authentic expression rather than commercial product set a standard that every folk, blues, and rock musician had to confront. His songs dealt with real issues: racism, prison life, economic inequality, human struggle, with an honesty that made sanitized popular music seem hollow by comparison. Country and bluegrass musicians embraced his ballads and storytelling style. Goodnight Irene became a standard covered by everyone from Frank Sinatra to Johnny Cash. His guitar techniques, particularly his use of the 12-string guitar, influenced generations of players who sought that big, resonant sound that could fill any room. Hip-hop artists would later sample his work, drawn to the rhythmic drive and social commentary that prefigured rap music by decades. Electronic musicians found inspiration in his minimalist arrangements and focus on groove over complexity. But perhaps most importantly, Leadbelly established the template for the artist as authentic voice rather than manufactured entertainer. In an industry increasingly focused on image and marketing, Leadbelly proved that real experience and genuine emotion could create music that lasted far longer than any commercial trend. His legacy wasn't just musical, it was moral. Leadbelly showed that music could be a form of resistance, a way to maintain dignity in the face of oppression, and a tool for survival in impossible circumstances. Every artist who has ever used their platform to speak truth to power owes something to the man who literally sang his way out of prison. Twice. By 1949, Leadbelly had achieved something that seemed impossible when he first walked out of Angola 15 years earlier. He had become an international star, touring Europe to sold-out crowds who hung on every note of his authentic American folk songs. The man who had started life picking cotton and serving time was now performing for kings and presidents. His 12-string guitar, Stella, recognized around the world. But success couldn't protect him from what was coming. While on his European tour, Leadbelly began experiencing strange symptoms: muscle weakness, difficulty gripping his guitar, problems with coordination that made playing increasingly painful. The man whose powerful voice and skilled fingers had literally saved his life was beginning to lose control of his body. When he returned to New York, doctors delivered devastating news that echoed another American legend's tragic fate. Leadbelly was diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease, the same progressive neurological condition that had claimed the baseball star just 8 years earlier. The disease attacks the motor neurons, gradually destroying a person's ability to control their muscles while leaving their mind completely intact. For a musician, the diagnosis was especially cruel. Leadbelly could still hear every note he wanted to play, could still feel every rhythm he wanted to create, but his hands were betraying him. The 12-string guitar that had been his salvation became an instrument of torture as his fingers refused to obey his commands. The irony was bitter and unavoidable. The man who had used his physical strength to pick 1,000 pounds of cotton a day, who had fought his way through violent encounters that left scars across his throat, who had wielded his guitar like a weapon against injustice, was being defeated by his own body. What made Leadbelly's diagnosis even more tragic was the timing. ALS was still poorly understood in 1949, and treatment options were virtually non-existent. When Lou Gehrig had faced the same disease, he had access to the best medical care in America and still succumbed within 2 years. Leadbelly, despite his fame, had neither the financial resources nor the medical connections to mount any meaningful fight against the disease. The progression was swift and merciless. Within months, Leadbelly could barely hold his guitar, let alone play it with the virtuosity that had made him famous. The man who had commanded stages from New York to London was reduced to sitting in his apartment, watching his body systematically shut down while his mind remained trapped inside, fully aware of everything he was losing. On December 6, 1949, just a few months after his diagnosis, Huddie Ledbetter died at the age of 64. He passed away in relative obscurity, far from the spotlight that had illuminated his final years. The man who had cheated death in barroom brawls and prison cells had finally met an opponent he couldn't outsmart or outfight. But even in death, Leadbelly's timing seemed touched by fate. Just months after his passing, the Weavers, a folk quartet, sent his song "Goodnight Irene" to #1 on the charts, introducing his music to millions of Americans who had never heard his name. The song that had helped him escape from Angola became his posthumous calling card. ensuring that his legacy would survive long after his voice had been silenced. The circumstances surrounding Leadbelly's death sparked questions that persist to this day. Some wondered if the violent lifestyle of his youth had somehow contributed to his neurological decline. Others questioned whether the stress of his constant battles against racism and exploitation had weakened his system. A few even suggested that his rapid decline might have been connected to environmental factors from his years in Southern prisons. What wasn't questioned was the profound loss his death represented. Leadbelly had died just as the folk revival was beginning to gain momentum, just as a new generation of musicians was discovering the power of authentic American roots music. He never got to see Bob Dylan revolutionize folk music, never witnessed the Beatles' transformation of popular culture, never knew that Kurt Cobain would channel his emotional intensity for a generation born decades after his death. The man who had sung himself out of prison twice had finally encountered bars he couldn't break, the prison of his own failing body. But his voice, captured on hundreds of recordings, would continue to unlock doors for generations of musicians who followed in his footsteps, proving that sometimes the most powerful escapes are the ones that happen long after the artist is gone. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye!